My name is Claire Thompson, and I am 32 years old. I work as a financial analyst in Boston, and on paper, my life looks steady, even successful. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment I stood in my kitchen, holding legal papers. Papers served by my own parents. After years of clawing my way up from nothing, after sacrificing every spare moment to build a home of my own near Fenway Park, they wanted me to sell it all. Not for me. Not for something that would change my life. No, they expected me to hand over everything I had worked for to fund my younger sister Emily's divorce. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. What I'm about to tell you is not just about favoritism or family drama, it's about betrayal so deep it cut through the very foundation of what I thought family was supposed to mean. And if you've ever been the responsible one, the one expected to clean up everyone else's mess, then maybe, just maybe, you'll see pieces of yourself in my story too. Before I dive into everything, do me a favor, hit that like button. If you've ever felt overlooked in your own family, leave a comment with where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more stories that reveal just how messy family ties can really be. I grew up in a suburb outside Chicago, the kind of place where the lawns were trimmed, the sidewalks were safe, and appearances mattered more than truths. In every family photo, Emily was always center stage, my parents' pride glowing as they posed with her, while I hovered on the edges, half out of frame. It wasn't that my parents shouted that she was the favorite. They didn't need to. Their actions told the story well enough. "Claire, you need to set a good example." That was the refrain of my childhood. When Emily broke my science project the night before it was due, my parents told me she was just curious. When she borrowed my clothes without asking and returned them stained, I was told to be more generous. The pattern was always the same. Emily took, and I was expected to accommodate. I wasn't given space to complain. My role was to absorb the damage and stay steady while Emily was free to spin in any direction she pleased. It took me years to understand what that dynamic did to me. To the outside world, it looked like my independence was a strength, that I had it all under control. But the truth is, independence wasn't a gift. It was survival. I didn't choose it. It was forced on me by parents who decided early on that one daughter deserved to be cherished, and the other should simply endure. And yet, endurance can only stretch so far before it breaks. What about you? Have you ever been in a position where you were expected to sacrifice for others, while no one ever gave back to you? I want to hear your stories in the comments, because I know I'm not alone in this. This is where my story really begins. In the quiet, painful realization that the home I had built with my own hands was never safe from their demands. And that night in my kitchen, with those legal papers trembling in my hands, I realized I would finally have to decide: continue being their scapegoat, or fight back for the first time in my life. When I look back on the years after high school, I can see the cracks forming in the foundation of who I thought I was and who I thought my family was. It's strange how memory works, how moments that felt small at the time now stand out like flashing warning lights. Graduation day was supposed to be a milestone, a celebration of hard work and new beginnings. For me, it was the moment I learned my future would not look anything like my sister Emily's. While my classmates posed with new cars, plane tickets, or envelopes stuffed with money, I walked out of my high school gymnasium with a simple greeting card from my parents. Inside was a $20 bill, and a message that felt like both a dismissal and a warning. "We're proud of you, Claire. Keep being responsible." When I asked why there wasn't a gift or any real acknowledgement, they didn't hesitate with the explanation. "We're saving for Emily's dance competition," my mother said, her tone carrying the kind of finality that dared me to protest. That moment was like a crack of thunder in my chest. It wasn't just the money, it was the message. Emily's pursuits, however frivolous or temporary, would always outrank my accomplishments. My sacrifices, my grades, my late nights, those were expected, not celebrated. College brought the lesson home with brutal clarity. My parents sat me down one evening, weeks before applications were due, and told me they hadn't set aside any money for my education. "You're independent," my father said, as if it were a compliment. You'll figure it out. And so I did. I chose the University of Wisconsin, Madison, not because it was my dream school, but because it gave me the best financial aid package. Even then, aid didn't cover everything. To stay afloat, I pieced together a schedule that would have broken most people. Morning shifts at the campus cafe, evenings waiting tables at a busy restaurant, and weekends spent hunched over a computer doing data entry for the business department. I lived on 4 hours of sleep, cheap coffee, and the desperate hope that all of this would eventually lead somewhere better. My roommate, Kelly, couldn't believe what she was seeing. Some mornings, she'd find me asleep at my desk, cheek pressed against half-finished notes. "Your parents don't help at all?" she asked one day, genuine disbelief in her voice. I gave the same rehearsed answer I had trained myself to say whenever someone questioned it: they believe in self-sufficiency. But even as I said it, the words tasted like ash in my mouth. Because deep down, I knew it wasn't about self-sufficiency. It was about worth. And in their eyes, Emily's worth outweighed mine, every single time. Meanwhile, Emily's life was a parade of indulgence. My parents proudly announced she had been accepted to a private university in New York City, the kind of place where tuition alone cost more than my entire 4 years combined. She didn't have to worry about housing or food or even a monthly stipend. They had set her up with everything: an allowance, a meal plan, and the freedom to live her college years like a socialite. When she came home on breaks, she would regale the family with stories of sorority formals, spring break trips, and designer clothes. My parents would hang on every word, smiling as though she were royalty, while I sat quietly at the table, too exhausted to offer much more than a nod. I don't think they even noticed. There were nights I cried silently into my pillow, the weight of exhaustion and loneliness pressing down on me. I told myself that it didn't matter, that one day my hard work would pay off. But even in my darkest hours, I couldn't ignore the bitterness growing inside me. Every shift I worked, every class I pushed through, every sacrifice I made, it all felt like proof that I was strong, yes, but also invisible. There was one night that crystallized it for me. I was working the late shift at the restaurant, scrubbing tables long after most of the staff had gone home. My phone buzzed with a picture from Emily. She was on a yacht somewhere off the coast of Miami, champagne glass in hand, her caption reading, "Living my best life." I stared at that picture until my vision blurred. My best life at that moment was counting crumpled dollar bills and calculating whether I could afford groceries and textbooks in the same week. I told myself it didn't matter, that I would never trade places with her, because what I was building was real. What I was enduring was shaping me into someone stronger. But it was a fragile mantra, one I repeated to myself only because the alternative that my own parents had chosen, her comfort over my survival, was too painful to bear. And yet, I kept going. I made honor roll every semester. I graduated without fanfare, no proud family photos with lees around my neck or extravagant parties. Just a quiet walk across a stage, diploma in hand, while my parents clapped politely and immediately turned to Emily to ask about her summer plans in New York. Still, I carried on. After graduation, I packed up my thrift store belongings and moved to Boston, chasing a job that barely covered rent but offered a glimmer of stability. I started over in a city where no one knew my story, where no one would look at me and immediately compare me to Emily. And even though the weight of what I'd endured clung to me, I held on to one truth: I had survived on my own. The contrast between my life and Emily's only sharpened in those years. She floated from one opportunity to the next, always cushioned by my parents' unwavering support. I clawed my way upward, building a life from scraps and sacrifice. It felt like a cruel joke, 2 daughters from the same family, but only one treated like a future worth investing in. The resentment hardened into resolve. If my parents weren't going to value me, I would value myself. If they wouldn't give me stability, I would build it with my own hands. That vow carried me into the next chapter of my life, where the stakes would rise higher, and the cost of their favoritism would come crashing into the home I had fought so hard to create. Because while I thought independence had freed me from their reach, I was wrong. Their demands would find me again, in ways more shocking and ruthless than I could have ever imagined. And that is where the story begins to shift. Moving to Boston was both the scariest and most liberating decision I had ever made. I was 22 years old, fresh out of college, with a battered suitcase, a few thrift store pots and pans, and just enough money in my checking account to cover 1 month's rent in a dingy studio apartment that smelled like mildew no matter how many candles I lit. The job I had landed as an entry-level financial analyst didn't pay much, but it paid just enough. And just enough was something I had trained my entire life to survive on. I remember my first day walking into the office. The glass building loomed above me, sharp and intimidating, as though it wanted to swallow me whole. Inside, my coworkers laughed together, sharing stories about ski trips, nights out, and expensive hobbies I couldn't even pretend to relate to. I smiled when I was supposed to, nodded at jokes I didn't fully understand, and went home each night to a lonely, peeling apartment where I ate canned soup at a folding card table that doubled as my desk. From the outside, I must have looked like the quiet one, maybe even antisocial, but the truth was simpler. I had a plan, and every part of my life bent around it. I had a goal that lived inside me like a fire I refused to let burn out. I wanted a home of my own. Something permanent. Something no one could take from me, no matter how much they had taken in the past. That meant sacrifice, the kind most people would never even consider. While my coworkers invited me to happy hours at upscale bars, I pretended I was too tired or buried in work. The truth was, I couldn't justify spending $20 on cocktails when that same 20 could buy groceries for the week. When they booked weekend getaways, I smiled and said I wasn't much of a traveler. I couldn't explain that I had already calculated the hours of overtime I would need to keep my savings account moving in the right direction. My evenings were a blur of numbers, spreadsheets, and silence. I tracked every penny in a notebook I carried with me everywhere. Rent, utilities, food, bus fare, the occasional thrifted sweater, it all had to be accounted for. I learned to stretch leftovers into new meals, to mend clothes instead of replacing them, to make do with less in every possible way. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the numbers in my savings account began to grow. There were nights when the loneliness felt crushing. I would sit by the window of that tiny studio, listening to the hum of traffic outside, watching couples walk home hand in hand, or groups of friends laughing together, and wonder if I was making the right choice. Was I sacrificing too much? Was I trading away my 20s, the years everyone said were supposed to be carefree, for a dream that might never materialize? But then I would open my notebook, run my fingers over the growing totals, and remind myself why I was doing this. I had spent my entire childhood being told that I was strong enough to fend for myself, while my sister Emily was coddled and carried. Fine. If strength was all I had, then I would turn it into something undeniable. I would build a foundation so solid that no one could question my worth again. It took 5 long years. 5 years of declining invitations, of patching the soles of my shoes with glue when they began to peel, of skipping vacations and wearing the same coat winter after winter. 5 years of falling asleep at my desk because I had picked up extra hours, of telling myself that loneliness was just another price to pay for independence. And then, at 28, it happened. I signed the papers on a modest 1-bedroom apartment near Fenway Park. The day I held those keys in my hand, I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry in years. They weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of triumph, of relief, of proof that every sacrifice, every lonely night, every missed opportunity had been worth it. Of course, the apartment itself was far from glamorous. The kitchen looked like it hadn't been updated since the late 1970s, with cabinets that creaked on rusty hinges and linoleum floors permanently stained by someone else's life. The carpet was worn thin, gray where it was supposed to be beige, and the bathroom's cracked pink tiles seemed to mock me with their stubborn ugliness. But it was mine, every inch of it. I didn't have the money to hire contractors or designers, so I rolled up my sleeves and did it myself. I spent countless nights watching YouTube tutorials on tiling, grouting, painting, and minor electrical fixes. My weekends were consumed by hardware store trips, clearance sales, and secondhand furniture hunts. I learned the satisfaction of transforming a space with my own two hands. Every brushstroke of paint, every nail hammered into place, felt like reclaiming something I had been denied for so long. I still remember the first night after I finished painting the living room. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the walls glowing a warm, soft gray instead of the dingy yellow they had been before, and I felt a kind of peace I had never known. This wasn't just shelter. It wasn't just property. It was evidence that I could take all the neglect, all the favoritism, all the unfairness of my past, and turn it into something beautiful, something permanent. I filled the space slowly, carefully, with pieces that spoke to me. A thrifted bookshelf that I sanded and painted until it looked new. A dining table I rescued from a curb and refinished, my hands aching from hours of work. A couch I found at a clearance outlet, paid for in cash, and hauled up 3 flights of stairs with the help of a neighbor who took pity on me. Every item carried a story, a memory of effort, patience, and persistence. By the time I was done, the apartment was more than just a home. It was a sanctuary. It was a physical embodiment of my determination to survive, to thrive, without anyone's help. For the first time in my life, I felt proud not because someone else told me I should be, but because I knew I had earned it. And yet, beneath that pride there was always a quiet fear. A fear that somehow, some way, it could all be taken from me. That the very people who had failed me so many times before might find a way to reach into this sanctuary and shatter it. That fear would prove to be more than just paranoia. Because while I believed I had finally carved out a corner of the world that was safe from my family's demands, I was wrong. Their shadows stretched farther than I realized. And soon, I would learn that no amount of paint, no carefully laid tile, no locked door could keep them from trying to claim what was mine. The peace I had fought so hard for was about to be threatened in ways I couldn't yet imagine, setting the stage for a battle that would test not only my independence but my very sense of self. If my life had been defined by discipline, sacrifice, and careful choices, my sister Emily's life was the complete opposite. She moved through the world with the reckless certainty of someone who believed a safety net would always be waiting beneath her. And the truth was, there always was. My parents had woven that net so tightly around her that no fall was ever too great, no mistake ever too costly. Watching it play out year after year was like standing in a storm you could never escape, bracing yourself for the inevitable damage that someone else's chaos would cause. Emily had always been magnetic. She had the kind of beauty that stopped people mid-sentence, the kind of charm that made strangers lean in closer just to hear her laugh. She was reckless with it, too, using it like currency, spending it freely without worrying about what would happen when the well ran dry. Jobs never lasted long, but there was always an excuse ready. Her boss was jealous of her talent, the environment was toxic, someone else was out to get her. She would storm out of one office with dramatic flair and be back in our parents' guest room the next day, tearfully recounting how unfair life was. And my parents, as always, believed her. When Emily met Mark Sullivan, I thought maybe things would change. Mark was older, in his mid-30s, established in his career as an attorney, and came from a well-connected Boston family. He seemed steady in a way Emily wasn't, grounding her with his quiet confidence. Their whirlwind romance took less than 5 months to turn into an engagement, and within a year, my parents had emptied their retirement savings to fund a wedding that could have been lifted straight from the pages of a glossy magazine. I stood beside her as maid of honor, my dress fitted, my smile practiced, and a strange knot tightening in my chest. I wanted to believe this was her turning point, that stability had finally found her. But when she leaned over to me during the reception, champagne sloshing in her glass, and whispered, "I'm set for life now." He's loaded. My stomach turned. Her words weren't about love or building a partnership. They were about security, money, and what she could take from him. For a little while, though, it seemed to work. Holidays were easier when Emily had Mark by her side. My parents, relieved that she had married well, directed their suffocating attention toward her marriage, instead of me. I kept my distance, breathing easier with each quiet evening in my own apartment, savoring the fragile peace I had carved out for myself. But peace in my family never lasted. The cracks began to show less than 2 years later. At first, it was subtle, a clipped tone when Emily called, a hint of tension in her voice when she spoke about Mark. Then came the longer silences, the missed family gatherings, the excuses about being too busy or too tired. By the time I was summoned to a family dinner to discuss important matters, I already knew something had gone terribly wrong. When Emily finally appeared at that dinner, she was barely recognizable. The sister who once strutted in designer heels and full makeup arrived in sweatpants, her hair tangled, her eyes red and swollen. She dropped herself into a chair and shot me a bitter look, as though my mere presence was an insult. The truth spilled out in pieces, torn between her sobs and my parents' frantic attempts to shield her from responsibility. Emily had been having an affair, not a fleeting mistake, but a long-term entanglement with one of Mark's friends. Mark had found out, and with their airtight prenup, he had wasted no time filing for divorce. The prenup contained a fidelity clause, and Emily's betrayal meant she was entitled to almost nothing. You would think that shame or regret would temper her, but instead she turned vicious. "He's trying to leave me with nothing," she wailed, as though it were Mark's cruelty rather than her own choices that had led her here. My parents sat beside her, stroking her hair, murmuring reassurances that she deserved more, that Mark was heartless. And then came the part that made my blood run cold. My father cleared his throat and said, "Emily needs a strong legal team, a good lawyer, the best. But those cost money. And we think you, Caroline, are in the best position to help." It was as though the air had been sucked out of the room. They were talking about my apartment, the one thing I had built on my own, the one fortress I had against all of this chaos. They wanted me to sell it, to liquidate years of sacrifice, in order to fund Emily's divorce battle. I couldn't even find words at first. Rage and disbelief collided inside me until my voice finally broke through. "You want me to sell my home because Emily cheated on her husband?" Emily's response was swift, her voice sharp. "It's just an apartment. You can get another one later. This is my life we're talking about." Her words struck me harder than I expected. To her, my years of labor, my sacrifices, my quiet determination meant nothing. My life's work was disposable if it meant saving hers. The conversation spiraled into guilt trips and manipulations. My parents insisted that family helps family, that I owed it to my sister. Emily accused me of being jealous, of thinking I was better than her. They painted me as cold, selfish, unloving, while conveniently forgetting the years I had carried myself without leaning on anyone. I left that dinner shaking with fury, my answer firm, no. I would not sell my apartment. I would not destroy the life I had fought to build for Emily's mistakes. But as I drove home, their words echoed in my head, carrying with them a sense of dread I couldn't shake. Because I knew my family, they never took no as an answer. They would push, twist, manipulate, and invade until they got what they wanted. And this time, what they wanted was everything I had worked for. I had no idea how far they would go, or how quickly Emily's unraveling life would pull mine into the same storm. What started as her marital breakdown was about to turn into something much darker, something that would test every boundary I had ever tried to set. And as much as I wanted to believe I could hold my ground, deep down, I sensed that the real battle had only just begun. The night of the family dinner still lives in my memory like a nightmare on repeat. I knew before I even stepped through the door that it wouldn't be a simple meal. My mother's voice on the phone had carried that heavy, loaded tone, the one that made it clear she wasn't inviting me, she was summoning me. By then, I had already felt the storm brewing, but nothing could have prepared me for just how far it would go. I parked outside my parents' house, staring at the warm glow spilling from the windows. It looked so deceptively normal, like any other suburban evening. But the dread sat heavy in my stomach. I tightened my grip on the bottle of wine I had brought, some foolish attempt at civility, and forced myself to walk up the path. Inside, the air was tense enough to cut with a knife. My father sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. My mother bustled in and out of the kitchen, her energy frantic, as though the meal itself could mask the tension pulsing beneath the surface. The only thing missing was Emily. "Where's Emily?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "In the guest room," my mother whispered, as if my sister were a fragile patient upstairs instead of a grown woman who had detonated her own life. "Don't bring up Mark unless she does." Dinner began in silence. Forks scraping against plates, the occasional clink of a glass, every sound felt magnified in the vacuum of conversation. And then, just as the roast was placed on the table, Emily made her entrance. I almost didn't recognize her. The sister who had always been polished and put together now looked hollowed out, her hair unwashed, her skin pale, her eyes ringed with red. She slumped into a chair and glanced at me with bitterness. "Nice of you to finally join us, Caroline." Before I could even respond, my father cleared his throat. "We might as well get to the point. Emily and Mark are getting divorced." The words hung in the air, heavy and inevitable. I offered the appropriate sympathy, though inside, my mind was already racing. Less than 3 years of marriage, and it had collapsed exactly the way I feared it would. When I asked what had happened, the dam broke. My mother gasped, my father's face darkened, and Emily burst into sobs. Between the tears and the interruptions, the truth bled out, piece by piece. The affair, the betrayal, the ironclad prenup that left her with almost nothing. But what came next was worse. My father leaned forward, his voice calm but deliberate. "Emily deserves a fair chance. She needs a strong attorney, someone who can fight this prenup. But good lawyers are expensive. We've been thinking." He exchanged a look with my mother. "Your apartment has appreciated quite a bit since you bought it, hasn't it?" The air seemed to leave my lungs. I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "We thought," my mother added, her tone soft, coaxing, "you could sell it, use the equity to help Emily with her legal fees. You could always move back into a rental for a while." It took me a few seconds to process, but when I did, rage boiled in my chest. My apartment, the place I had bled for, sacrificed for, built with my own hands, they wanted me to dismantle it, as though it were nothing more than an asset to be liquidated for Emily's mistakes. "That's not going to happen," I said finally, my voice steady even as my heart pounded. My father's eyes narrowed. "Now, Caroline, family helps family. When one of us is in trouble, we all pitch in." I snapped before I could stop myself. "And when have any of you ever pitched in for me?" The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's lips parted in wounded disbelief. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head." "The bare minimum," I countered. "I worked my way through college while you paid for Emily's private education. I saved for years, living in places with leaks and broken heat, while you drained your retirement for her wedding. Every dollar that went into my home came from my own sweat. And now you want me to give it up because she cheated on her husband?" "It's just an apartment," Emily snapped suddenly, her voice sharp with venom. "You can get another one. This is my life we're talking about." Her words were like a slap. "And that apartment is my life," I shot back. "It represents everything I've worked for. I am not selling it." The tension exploded from there. My father's voice grew cold, authoritarian. "We're not asking for charity. Think of it as a loan." I laughed bitterly. "A loan? When has Emily ever paid back anything? Do you remember the $5,000 she borrowed for her deposit after college? Or the car you co-signed for that got repossessed?" "That's unfair," my mother protested. "No. What's unfair is expecting me to sacrifice everything, while Emily continues to face no consequences for her actions." I offered alternatives. My parents could take out a home equity loan, Emily could get a job, or she could accept a smaller settlement. Each suggestion was dismissed with excuses. My parents claimed they were already mortgaged to the limit. Emily insisted no lawyer would take her case on installments. Then, with shocking entitlement, she declared, "I deserve half of everything Mark has." The shouting escalated, guilt trips layered with outright manipulation. My mother wept about everything she had done for me. My father accused me of being heartless. Emily hissed that I had always been jealous of her. It felt like every ugly dynamic of our childhood had been resurrected at that dinner table, sharpened into weapons. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'm done. My answer is no. I won't sell my apartment. I won't fund Emily's mess. I'll help her update her resume. I'll drive her to interviews, but I will not dismantle my life for hers. As I headed for the door, my father's voice followed me, low and chilling. This isn't over, Caroline. One way or another, you'll do the right thing for your sister. A shiver ran down my spine. His tone wasn't just disappointed, it was threatening. I walked out without looking back, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. Driving home, I tried to convince myself that they would eventually come to their senses, that this insane demand would die in the light of reason. But deep down, I already knew better. My family had never accepted boundaries, and when I refused to bend, they pushed harder. That dinner wasn't the end of the fight, it was only the beginning. And soon enough, their campaign to break me would escalate into something far darker than I had ever imagined. I thought that night at my parents' dinner table would be the peak of their audacity. I thought once I made myself clear once, I said no in a voice firm enough to rattle the silverware, they would let the idea die. Families argue, emotions run hot, but surely, I told myself, even they wouldn't push further. I was wrong. What followed was not just persistence. It was an onslaught that left me questioning how much cruelty people who claim to love you could really inflict. It started with phone calls. Dozens a day, each one more desperate, more guilt-ridden, more manipulative than the last. My mother's voice, trembling as she asked how I could sleep at night while my sister was suffering. My father's lectures about loyalty, about responsibility, about family being a bond stronger than reason. Emily's shrill accusations, reminding me she had always been the one my parents loved most, as if that fact alone was enough to justify her demands. When I stopped answering, the texts came. At first, they were long paragraphs, pleading, reasoning, begging me to reconsider. When that didn't work, they grew short and sharp. You're heartless. You'll regret this. We raised you, and this is how you repay us? I blocked their numbers, one by one, but like water seeping through cracks, they found other ways to reach me. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years began contacting me. Cousins, aunts, uncles, all of them carrying the same message: do the right thing. Your mother is beside herself, Aunt Patricia scolded in a voicemail. How can you be so selfish? Selfish. That word burrowed deep under my skin, because it was the very label I had spent my entire life trying to avoid. I had been trained to be the opposite of selfish, to give until I had nothing left. And now, because I refused to destroy myself one more time, I was branded the villain. I could have endured the harassment, the whispers in the family network. But then the line was crossed in ways I couldn't have predicted. One afternoon, I received a call from my bank. Someone had attempted to access my accounts using an old password. The attempt was traced back to my parents' home IP address. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. The realization hit me like ice in my veins. They hadn't just pressured me, they had tried to steal from me. I changed my passwords, added layers of security, and tried to breathe through the violation. But before I could even recover, Emily showed up at my office. She didn't just show up, she caused a scene. She stormed into the reception area in ripped jeans and smeared mascara, screaming my name like she was a character in a soap opera. My clients, my coworkers, everyone watched as she accused me of abandoning her, of valuing a stupid apartment more than my sister's life. Security had to escort her out, but the damage was already done. That night, I sat on the floor of my living room, shaking. The apartment that had once felt like a fortress suddenly seemed fragile. If Emily could storm into my professional world, what was stopping her from showing up at my building? What was stopping my parents from trying again to force their way into my finances? I turned to my closest friend, Zoe, the one person who had stood by me through everything. We met at a quiet bar, and the moment she saw my face, she knew. "They're terrorizing you," she said flatly after I poured everything out. "This isn't family pressure anymore. This is harassment. And it won't stop until you draw a line they can't cross." Her words rattled inside me. I had spent my whole life telling myself that no matter how unfair things were, family was family. But what happens when family stops being a source of love and becomes a source of danger? What happens when the people who raised you are the very ones trying to dismantle you? The next escalation came 3 days later. I came home to find a courier waiting at my door, holding a thick envelope. I signed for it, my stomach already twisting, and tore it open the moment I stepped inside. Legal documents spilled across my kitchen counter. My parents weren't just trying to manipulate me anymore, they were suing me. The complaint alleged that I had verbally agreed to sell my apartment to fund Emily's legal fees. They claimed to have witnesses to this so-called agreement, though I knew no such agreement had ever taken place. And then came the detail that made my knees buckle. As evidence, they had attached pages from my childhood journals, private notebooks I had left behind when I moved out, filled with the raw, unfiltered thoughts of a girl who still wanted desperately to be loved. In those journals, I had written things like, "I'll always be there for my family, and I want to take care of them." They had taken those words, twisted them, and weaponized them against me. I sank to the floor, those papers spread around me, my chest heaving with disbelief. The betrayal was total. It wasn't just about money anymore. They had crossed into my most private world, dragging my own words out into the open as though they were contracts. For the first time in my life, I sobbed the way a child sobs loud. Raw, uncontrollable. All the years of being overlooked, all the sacrifices, all the attempts to be the good daughter came pouring out of me in waves. And beneath the grief was a realization sharper than any knife. I would never be enough for them. No achievement, no sacrifice, no gesture of loyalty would ever be enough. Because in their eyes, my role was already written. I was the responsible one. The backup plan. The one who would give until there was nothing left. But I had something left. I had my apartment. My independence. And now, for the first time, I had fury on my side. As I gathered the scattered pages back into the envelope, my tears drying into something harder, I felt a shift deep in my chest. If they wanted a battle, they would get one. I had spent my whole life accommodating them, bending under their weight, sacrificing my own happiness for their comfort. That part of me was gone. The lawsuit was more than an attack on my property. It was a declaration that they believed I would never fight back. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. And with that realization, I picked up the phone, ready to take the first step toward defending not just my home, but myself. The battle lines had been drawn, and for the first time, I was willing to fight until the very end. The lawsuit should have been the climax of my family's cruelty, the peak of their betrayal. But instead, it was only the beginning of something darker, something far more invasive. Once the legal battle was set into motion, they no longer hid their intentions behind guilt trips or whispered demands. They came at me full force, tearing away what little illusion of family I had left. In the weeks after being served, I lived like a prisoner inside my own home. Every time my phone buzzed, I flinched, knowing it could be another attack. At first, it was the extended family again. Long emails filled with passive-aggressive sermons about loyalty, cousins parroting the lines they had clearly been fed. "Blood is thicker than water. You'll regret this when you're alone." Some even suggested I was overreacting, as if being sued by my own parents was a trivial disagreement, like a squabble over holiday plans. Then came the violation that shook me to my core. While gathering paperwork for my attorney, Elena, I pulled my credit report and nearly dropped the folder in my hands. There were loans listed under my name, loans I had never taken out. They dated back to my college years, with signatures that looked just close enough to mine to pass at a glance. The money had gone somewhere, but not to me. Piece by piece, with Elena's help, I traced it back. My parents had taken out over $30,000 in fraudulent student loans using my identity, draining me for years with mystery deductions I had thought were legitimate. That discovery hollowed me out. It wasn't just emotional manipulation anymore, it was financial theft. They had reached into the very marrow of my adult life, stealing not just from my present, but from my past. All those nights I'd gone hungry in college, convinced I was just unlucky, while Emily flaunted her luxuries, those weren't coincidences. They had chosen to bleed me dry. When I confronted them about it, recording the call as Elena advised, their lack of remorse was staggering. "We did what we had to do for the family," my father said flatly, as though committing fraud in my name was no more significant than borrowing a sweater. My mother's voice wavered only with anger, not guilt. "You were always stronger. Emily wasn't built for struggle." That sentence burned into me like acid. Built for struggle. As though I had been designed to suffer so Emily wouldn't have to. The harassment escalated from there. My parents showed up at my apartment building, telling the security guard I was having a breakdown and needed to be checked on. They tried to use an old spare key to get inside, only to find I had changed the locks. Security cameras caught them peering through my windows, my father scribbling notes in a small pad like he was inventorying my belongings. When I showed the footage to Elena, she pressed her lips into a hard line. "They're building a case to argue you don't live here, that this place isn't your primary residence," she explained. "It's trespassing, but it's also a strategy." And then came Emily, always the chaos incarnate. One evening I was walking home from work, the late autumn wind biting at my cheeks, when I saw her leaning against the entrance of my building. Her makeup was smudged, her hair disheveled, but her eyes burned with fury. "You think you're better than me?" she hissed the moment I was close enough. Neighbors walked by, glancing nervously as her voice rose. "You're letting me drown while you sit in your precious apartment like a queen." I tried to brush past her, but she grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I wrenched free and hissed back, "This isn't your home, it's mine. You need to leave." She shouted after me, her words echoing down the block. "You'll lose it anyway, they'll take it from you, just wait." That night, I sat in the dark of my living room, the shadows stretching long across the walls I had painted with my own hands, and I realized something terrifying. They weren't going to stop. This wasn't a battle of reason or negotiation, it was war. My boss, Gregory, had already warned me this could damage my career if I didn't act decisively. And Zoe, my anchor through all of this, kept repeating the same thing. "They won't stop until you force them to stop." For the first time in my life, I accepted that my family wasn't just difficult. They weren't misguided or blinded by favoritism. They were dangerous. So I let Elena build the countersuit. We compiled everything, the fraudulent loans, the harassment timeline, the security footage, even the recorded phone calls where my parents admitted I was the safety net, meant to catch Emily forever. The evidence piled higher, heavier, until it felt less like a file and more like a weapon. But even as we prepared to strike back, the fear lingered. Every creak in the hallway outside my apartment made my chest tighten. Every unknown number flashing across my phone made my pulse race. I double-checked the locks each night, installed extra cameras, even considered moving out temporarily. Zoe stayed over some nights, bringing groceries and a calm presence, reminding me I wasn't as alone as I felt. Still, the weight of their obsession pressed against me constantly, threatening to crack me open. One evening, just when I thought I had seen the worst, I received an unexpected message. It wasn't from my parents or Emily, it was from Mark, my sister's soon-to-be ex-husband. He wanted to meet, claiming he had information that could help me. At first, I hesitated after everything, trusting anyone felt dangerous. But Elena encouraged me to hear him out, as long as it was in a public place with witnesses. When Mark and I finally sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, his face looked older, drawn, worn thin by his own battles with Emily. He slid a folder across the table, his hands shaking. Inside were bank records, text messages, and damning evidence not only of Emily's betrayal, but of my parents' active involvement in trying to pressure me into bailing her out. And then, he dropped the final bombshell. Emily's financial ruin wasn't just about the divorce. She had a gambling addiction, one that had cost them over $100,000 in a single year. My parents had been covering her debts, hiding the truth even as they tried to strip me of everything I had. I stared at those documents, my mind spinning. All those years of being told Emily was delicate, that she wasn't built for struggle, that I was supposed to save her, it had all been a cover for her recklessness. And now, they wanted me to be the one to pay for her destruction. It was a revelation that hardened something in me permanently. They weren't just misguided. They weren't just blind. They were complicit. And if they thought I would crumble under the weight of their lies and manipulation, they were about to learn that I wasn't the daughter they could control anymore. Because with every escalation, with every betrayal, they had pushed me into becoming someone I had never dared to be before, someone who was ready to fight with everything I had left. And the real fight, the one that would expose everything, was just around the corner. The moment I opened the manila folder Mark had slid across the table, I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the cafe. The din of other patrons faded, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. Inside were pages of printed text messages, bank statements, and even copies of emails. Each one was like a blade, slicing through the thin fabric of denial I had clung to about my family. The first page I read was a series of text exchanges between Emily and my parents. The words were casual, almost mundane, yet they carried the weight of a noose tightening around me. "She has money tied up in that condo," my mother had written. "We just need to make her understand. It's her responsibility to help." My father's reply was worse. "Caroline has always been the safety net. She'll break eventually." Seeing those words in black and white made my stomach twist. They hadn't just assumed I would help, they had plotted it, counted on it, built their plan on the foundation of my obedience. I turned the page and found bank statements. Large sums had been withdrawn from joint accounts Mark shared with Emily, amounts that didn't match any household expenses. Alongside them were casino charges, hotel stays in Atlantic City, and payments to online gambling platforms. Emily had told the family she was destitute, a victim of Mark's cruelty, but the truth was sprawled out before me in neat rows of numbers. She hadn't lost everything because of him. She had burned through it herself, dollar by dollar, chasing the high of risk. But the part that shook me to my core came later in the stacked screenshots of messages between Emily and my parents. In them, they strategized about how to pressure me. My mother suggested guilt, sending reminders of all they had done for me. My father pushed for intimidation, warning Emily to keep the pressure constant so I'd eventually cave. And then there was Emily herself, writing in a moment of fury. If she really loved this family, she'd give up the damn apartment already. I felt nauseous. There it was, proof that their loyalty to each other outweighed any love they claimed to have for me. They weren't misguided. They weren't desperate parents making rash decisions. They were conspirators, plotting behind my back, using every tool they had to break me. I looked up at Mark, my hands trembling as I shuffled the papers back into the folder. "Why are you giving me this?" My voice came out raw, almost hoarse. "Because," he said, his expression lined with exhaustion, "I know what it's like to be their target. They used me too. Emily drained me, your parents enabled her, and now they're trying to shift the wreckage onto you. They'll keep doing it until someone stops them." His words hit like a revelation. For so long, I had believed I was the only one bearing the weight of their manipulation, but I wasn't alone. They had left a trail of destruction through anyone who had gotten too close, and now I had the evidence to prove it. That night, I sat at my dining table, the folder spread out before me. I read and reread those texts, those emails, those statements, until the words blurred and the numbers danced on the page. I thought about the little girl I used to be, scribbling in her diary that she would always take care of her family, believing that love was enough to bind us together. I wanted to reach back in time, take that pen from her hand, and tell her the truth. that her words would one day be twisted into chains meant to strangle her. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak of the building, every passing car outside made me jump. I felt hunted, exposed. The walls of my sanctuary seemed thinner now, as if their betrayal had seeped into the very paint, staining everything I had built with the ugly truth. The next morning, I brought the folder to Elena. She spread the documents across her sleek glass desk, her sharp eyes scanning quickly. A slow, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "This changes everything," she said. "This isn't just harassment anymore. This is a coordinated effort to defraud you, to manipulate you into financial ruin. Judges don't take kindly to conspiracies like this." Her confidence steadied me, but only for a moment, because even with proof, even with the law on my side, there was still the emotional wound, the bone-deep realization that my parents had chosen Emily's chaos over my survival. Again and again, they had made that choice. And now, they weren't just asking me to sacrifice. They were demanding it, weaponizing every part of my life to force me into submission. The betrayal was complete, written out in ink and numbers, undeniable and brutal. There was no way to convince myself anymore that they loved me in their own way, that their favoritism was just blind affection. Love doesn't steal your identity. Love doesn't try to strip you of your home. Love doesn't plot behind your back, confident you will break. That night, as I stared out at the city lights glittering across Boston, a strange calm settled over me. The evidence was in my hands now. Their words, their schemes, their disdain for me, it was all documented. For the first time, I wasn't the one telling a story no one believed. I had proof, black and white proof, and with that proof came clarity. They weren't my family anymore, not in the way that mattered. They were adversaries, and I would treat them as such. But clarity doesn't erase fear. If they had gone this far, what would stop them from going further? Would they try to ruin my career, sabotage my friendships, or drag me through the mud publicly? I didn't know. What I did know was that the battle I had been avoiding my entire life was finally here, unavoidable and inescapable. The folder on my table wasn't just evidence, it was a declaration. And from this point on, everything was about to escalate in ways none of us could ever take back. The morning of the hearing arrived with a stillness that felt almost unnatural, as if the city itself were holding its breath. I dressed carefully, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. A navy suit, understated jewelry, nothing flashy, just enough to project control. I told myself that if I looked composed, maybe I could convince my heart to stop hammering against my ribs. My apartment, the one place that had always felt like a fortress, suddenly seemed smaller, almost claustrophobic. I grabbed the folder of documents Elena had prepared and forced myself out the door. The courthouse loomed ahead like something out of a film, tall, imposing, all glass and stone, that reflected the gray Boston sky. Elena was waiting for me on the steps, her presence calm and unshakable. "Remember," she said as we climbed the marble stairs together, "we're not here to convince them you're innocent. We're here to prove they're guilty. And we have more than enough." Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, but the intimacy made it worse. I could feel every pair of eyes. My parents sat across the aisle, Emily beside them, all three avoiding my gaze. My father's face was carved from stone, my mother's eyes red from tears that I knew were more performance than remorse. And Emily looked both defiant and desperate, her foot tapping nervously under the table. Their lawyer, a weary-looking man, with a frayed briefcase, flipped through papers, as though trying to piece together a defense at the last possible moment. When the judge entered, a woman with sharp eyes and a presence that filled the room, the air shifted. We all rose, then sat, and the proceedings began. Elena opened with precision, her voice even, deliberate, her words slicing through the quiet like a scalpel. She laid out the facts. The fraudulent loans taken in my name, the harassment, the trespassing, the attempted theft of my financial information, and the evidence that they had conspired to pressure me into selling my home. One by one, she displayed the documents, the recordings, the photographs. Each piece of evidence was like a stone stacked carefully on a wall, building a fortress of truth that no denial could topple. I sat there, hands clenched in my lap, as Elena played the recording of my father saying, "Caroline has always been the safety net. She'll break eventually." Hearing it echo through the courtroom sent a chill up my spine. My parents shifted uncomfortably, my mother's face tightening, my father staring straight ahead, as though by refusing to react, he could erase his own words. Then it was their turn. Their lawyer attempted to paint their actions as parental concern. He suggested the fraudulent loans had been taken with my verbal consent, though the paperwork clearly showed signatures forged when I wasn't even present. He claimed their attempts to enter my apartment were out of worry for my mental health, not malice. The words were hollow, crumbling under the weight of the evidence. The judge leaned forward, her sharp gaze piercing. "Are you suggesting that opening credit lines in your daughter's name without her knowledge constitutes parental concern?" she asked. The lawyer stammered, fumbling for a response, while my mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, whispering that they had only ever wanted what was best for Emily. The turning point came when my father was called to the stand. He tried to maintain his composure, speaking in that same authoritative tone he had used my whole life. But under Elena's questioning, the cracks began to show. When she pressed him about the fraudulent loans, he admitted they had taken them out for the family, though he never explained why I, and not Emily, had been the one forced to carry the burden. "And what about this recording?" Elena asked, her voice steady as she replayed his words about me being the safety net. My father's jaw tightened. Every family has roles. Caroline was always capable, independent. Emily needed more. "Did Caroline ever receive the same support Emily did?" Elena countered. He shifted in his seat. "She didn't need it. So because she was capable, she was punished with neglect and exploitation?" Elena's words cut like a knife. My father's face reddened, but he couldn't answer. And then, as if the universe wanted to seal the moment, Emily broke. She stood suddenly, her voice high and shaking, tears streaming down her face. "It's not fair. Everyone always thinks she's the victim. She thinks she's perfect because she has her stupid apartment and her stupid job. But you don't know what it's like to be me, to have all the pressure, to be the one expected to shine." The courtroom froze. The judge raised a hand, ordering her to sit, but the damage was done. Her words were not the confession of someone mistreated, they were the outburst of someone drowning in entitlement. I felt a strange calm wash over me then, sitting silently as the chaos unfolded. For years, I had been gaslit into questioning my reality, into believing maybe I was the selfish one, maybe I hadn't given enough. But here, in this sterile room with its wooden benches and harsh lighting, the truth was laid bare. The judge called for a brief recess, and Elena leaned toward me. Her hand rested lightly on my arm. "You're winning," she whispered. "That outburst just did half my job." When court resumed, the judge's tone had shifted. She dismissed the notion of parental concern outright, noting the consistent pattern of exploitation and manipulation. She acknowledged the fraudulent loans, the trespassing, the harassment, and the conspiracy evidenced in the texts and emails. My parents' lawyer tried to protest, but his words were drowned out by the judge's stern rebuke. "Family is not a justification for fraud," she said firmly. "Family is not a shield for harassment. What I see here is not care or concern. What I see is coercion." As the gavel struck to signal her ruling on the preliminary motions, I felt my chest rise with a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't over yet, the proceedings would continue, but the tide had turned. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one standing accused, scrambling to defend myself. The truth was no longer just mine to carry. It was recognized, validated, spoken aloud by authority. And in that moment, as I sat in the courtroom with my parents and sister across from me, I realized this wasn't just about saving my apartment anymore. It was about reclaiming my life. The fight wasn't finished. The hardest blows were still to come. But I knew then, as the judge's words echoed in my mind, that I had already begun to win. And the reckoning my family had never believed possible was finally within reach. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in years, Not because everything was perfect, far from it, but because I had finally faced the storm I had been running from my entire life. For once, I wasn't the quiet daughter enduring in silence, carrying everyone else's chaos. I was the woman who stood her ground, who refused to bend, who chose herself over the endless cycle of sacrifice. It's strange to describe the feeling of breaking free. It wasn't joy, not exactly. It was relief. It was standing on solid ground after years of quicksand. My parents' betrayal had cut me deeper than I ever thought possible. But it also gave me clarity. I saw the truth for what it was. I had been raised not as someone to be cherished, but as someone to be used. And yet, despite everything, I survived. More than that, I won. The apartment that started as my sanctuary now carries a new meaning. It isn't just a symbol of my independence, it's a reminder that I am allowed to protect myself. I am allowed to draw boundaries. I am allowed to say no, even when it hurts, even when the people demanding my compliance share my blood. Because family is not defined by biology. Family is defined by love, by respect, by reciprocity. And when those things are absent, clinging to the word family only chains you to pain. If there is one lesson I want to leave you with, it's this. You do not owe your peace, your future, or your hard-earned stability to anyone who disrespects or exploits you. Even if they are your parents, your siblings, or the people who raised you. Saying no is not selfish. Protecting yourself is not cruel. Sometimes, the most radical act of love you can perform is the one you extend to yourself. I've started to rebuild in small ways, new traditions with friends who feel like family, therapy sessions that help me untangle the scars of the past, moments of quiet where I let myself breathe without guilt. It isn't easy, but it's worth it. Because life after breaking free isn't just survival, it's possibility. So, sit back and think about your own life for a moment. Where are you giving more than you can afford to give? Who are you protecting at the expense of yourself? And most importantly, when will you decide that your well-being matters just as much as anyone else's? If my story resonated with you, please like this video, leave a comment sharing your own experiences, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and share it with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to choose themselves. Now I want to ask you, have you ever had to set a boundary that felt impossible, only to realize it was the very thing that saved you?